style of the day. Even a great orator and bitter rival like Cicero was forced to admit that he knew of no more impressive speaker than Julius Caesar. And by the way, this was in an age when public speaking and rhetoric was very, very, very important. Public speaking and rhetoric are lost arts today in public life in this age of TV sound bites and image engineering. Caesar also possessed some less than perfect traits. Most notably, like other military commanders of his day, he was a conqueror and plunderer of lands, and he also extorted huge sums from rich kings. I can't get too exercised about that one, actually. What really upset the Senate oligarchs was not Caesar's accumulation of power, but how he used the power. Like other populares before him, he attempted to deal with unemployment, he attempted to deal with poverty, he attempted to deal with unfair taxes, he attempted to deal with debt relief, land redistribution, and aristocratic greed. And those were unforgivable things. A ruling class will forgive anything except if you just tiptoe on their interests and smudge the edge of their interests one bit. That's what they don't forgive. If the aristocrats longed to protect the Constitution, which by the way was an unwritten one of custom and practice, it was not out of some abstract commitment to Republican principles. It was because the Constitution fortified their oligarchy. It was their law, their Constitution, it was their republic. And it was made to accommodate their, quote, traditional class interests. Aristocratic freedom is not meant to serve a popular ruler or a democratic constitution. It's meant to serve no ruler except the aristocrats themselves. And when they were talking about freedom, they're talking about their freedom to do what they want unaccountably to any other social groups. Aristocratic freedom is the freedom to maintain one's own enormous class privileges, to enjoy every prerogative of power and wealth without restraint. It was, and it still is to this day, antithetical to popular democracy. Aristocratic freedom continues to be pursued today by corporate elites with their MAI, GATT, and NAFTA, the aristocracy of international global finance, to devise means of giving them power that is unaccountable to popular sovereignty. Julius Caesar was the last of a long line of populares. I want to talk about some of the others a little bit, not too much. Is this too dense, too much? Are you following me okay? Okay. Not too many are. You're all awake. You all look awake. Okay, good. One of the first was Tiberius Gracchus in 133 BC. He was the one who put that great land reform program to give the land back to the small farmers. He was assassinated. He was followed by his younger brother, the brilliant leader, Gaius Gracchus. And then there were some 10 or 12 others down the line, ending with Caesar and a few others after Caesar, less notable. And almost all of them were murdered. Both the Gracchi brothers were murdered, along with thousands of their followers, by the aristocratic death squads. Other leaders met sudden and untimely deaths, sometimes under suspicious circumstances. We're talking about here almost a century period, 133 to 44. Remember, the numbers go backwards now. We're in BC, in case you were getting confused. What all these leaders had in common was that they challenged the rigged oligarchic system. Even if they broke no laws, they were branded by the nobles and by the gentleman historians of that day and today as provocateurs. Here's a sort of who gave affront to sacred custom by unlawfully encroaching on the Senate's domain. Ill-judged and short-sighted transgressors. This is a composite quote from various writers. According to some historians, these popular leaders had to share the blame for their own deaths because they acted in such a rash and provocative way, especially the Gracchi. And this business of blaming the reformers for the homicidal violence that's delivered on them by conservative forces is a time-honored practice. I'm reminded of how a modern-day popular leader, President Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, in the early 70s, attempted egalitarian reform in the face of an entrenched military and corporate power, only to be murdered, along with thousands of his supporters. And shortly after the military coup, Pinochet's coup, the New York Times editorialized, quote, "A heavy share," get that, "a heavy share of the blame for the disaster must be assigned to the unfortunate Dr. Allende himself. A blame for the disaster of all these killings and the murder also of Chilean democracy. A heavy share must go to the unfortunate Dr. Allende himself for pushing a program of socialist reform for which he had no mandate," unquote. In fact, Allende had a sizable plurality. He had won 2 major national elections, and he had a growing mandate. That's why they had the coup. His percentage of votes in the second election was even higher. I mean, for his Popular Front. But assuming he didn't have a mandate, does that become grounds for giving him a heavy share of the blame for his own murder? The last to be blamed by the New York Times and most of the U.S. press, the last to be blamed for the mass killings were the killers themselves, the Chilean military, financed, trained, advised by the U.S. national security state. For the many historians, getting back to Rome, in whom the ghost of Cicero lives and breathes, the senatorial oligarchs of ancient Rome are not to be blamed at all for the massacres and assassinations they perpetrated. Listen to Scullard's polemical gymnastics. Quote, "The prudent senators were forced to confront the overzealous reformer." He's talking about Tiberius Gracchus in 133. "The urban mob that thronged the assembly in Rome was becoming increasingly irresponsible." There's a whole vocabulary here that they can roll out, you know. "Tiberius was threatening to turn the tribunes into agents of the popular will." Imagine that. "This would have given the assembly greater responsibility than it could properly wield," unquote. So of course they had to kill him. By the way, like every ruling oligarchy in history, the Roman Senate had a long tradition of violating its own traditions and its own constitution when necessity dictated, when class interest dictated. And this brings us to Parenti's second iron rule of politics. Don't ask me what the first is. I just like to call it the second iron rule of politics, which I first, in the first edition of Democracy for the Few back in 1974, I enunciated this rule, and it goes like this: when change threatens to rule, then the rules are changed. And faced with challenges from democratic forces, the oligarchs repeatedly invoked martial law, repeatedly suspended their own constitution, suspended all rights, appointed a dictator, and in Appian's phrase, quote, found salvation in absolute power. All the emperors who came after Caesar wielded substantially more power than he, and yet the senators went along with them. What about that? There then followed, you know, starting with Caesar's grandnephew, Octavius, later called Augustus and then called Caesar Augustus, the first emperor really, and a whole series, centuries of emperors after this. The Senate never complained about their power. They wielded absolute power, like way beyond anything Caesar had. But the senators went along with them because the emperors destroyed whatever power the popular assemblies once had. They initiated regressive taxes and attempted no economic redistribution on behalf of the masses. The Senate, too, was reduced in power. It was reduced to a kind of House of Lords, you know, a lot of prestige but very little power, where these guys could go in and dawdle and sit around and debate. But the important thing was that during the empire, the aristocrats grew still wealthier. In short, when their class interests were at stake, the senators, like elites today, had no trouble choosing political dictatorship over the palest traces of economic democracy. No more than did the Chilean elites in Chile have any trouble siding with Pinochet, even if it meant an end to their own oligarchic rule. When push came to shove, their vast holdings meant more to them than their, quote, Republican